A reading from Matthew chapter 5 verses 38 through 41. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile.
Fight Like Jesus. It's the title of our new series that begins today, and the very word fight in the title implies that Jesus was in no way a pushover, a doormat, a wallflower, or a wimp. In the face of trouble, intimidation, or injustice, Jesus never backed down, walked away, or waffled or equivocated, nor was Jesus anyone's victim or tool. Jesus, in fact, fought for what he believed in, and he fought for what he stood for, and he fought for those who didn't have a leg to stand on. Jesus was a fighter, and over these 6 weeks, we'll learn some of his fighting tactics, because the radical way Jesus chose to fight changed his world and still has the power to change us and ours. But that raises the fundamental question at the heart of this series. Do people really change? Can people really change? Maybe you've said, wow, this new pair of jeans or that new Taylor Swift album is life-changing, but we're not talking about that kind of change. Maybe you never liked ketchup. You couldn't stomach even the thought of ketchup, but then you got pregnant, or you got COVID, or you found tomato enlightenment, and now you just can't get enough ketchup. Now, over time, look, our tastes change, our styles change, our waistlines, hairlines, and jawlines change, but do we change? Can people really change? Now, how we answer that question will ultimately determine how we choose to fight in this world. Because if we believe people cannot change or will not ever change, we will likely choose to otherize them, or dehumanize them, or demonize and villainize them until we've turned them into our enemy. And it's only then, when we no longer see them as fully human, as children of God, that we can justify violent words or actions to either force them to change or defeat them altogether. Violence comes in many forms, of course. It's not just physical. It's verbal, emotional, psychological, spiritual, societal, systemic. Violence is not just blatant and obvious, but often subtle, elusive, and shifty. A couple went to a therapist to work on their communication, and the husband said, whenever we get into an argument, she never fights back. She always leaves the room. And the therapist asked the wife how she typically controls her anger, and she said, I go and clean the toilet. And the therapist asked, how does that help? And she said, I use his toothbrush. What is violence? Simply put, violence is the willful use of force or power, threatened or actual, against a person or group of persons that results in physical, psychological, emotional, or spiritual harm. And Jesus never once fought with violence or taught that violence was an acceptable response to the violence that we're apt to face in our lives. Jesus taught a different way of living, a nonviolent way of life that required the people of his day to act with courage as they faced injustice and oppression while living under Roman occupation. It wasn't simply that Jesus believed this nonviolent way of life was a matter of taking the high road, or an expression of loving one's neighbor as oneself, or even that it was an expression of loving God. It was all of those things, of course, but Jesus also believed that his way of nonviolence was the only way his people could assert their dignity under Roman rule, and then in the process to win over their oppressors. Imagine the streets of your city, your neighborhood, flooded with occupying soldiers, battalions, tanks. Every time you walk out the door, you're intimidated, bullied, or beaten by your occupiers. Everywhere you look, you see glaring reminders that you are not free. Foreign flags, weapons of war, wooden crosses on street corners bearing the crucified bodies of agitators and dissenters. And worse than knowing that you are not free is being treated as though you are not even human. And that was the principal tactic of the Roman Empire in dealing with the Jews of Jesus' day. Public humiliation and shame. The Romans didn't actually want to destroy the Jews. The Jews were a valuable commodity. They paid taxes to fund the Roman war machine. The Romans only needed to keep the Jews from rising up or rebelling. They had to subdue and control them, and humiliation was their tactic. And this is crucial in understanding Jesus' teaching today from Matthew's Gospel. It's one of the most misunderstood teachings of Jesus. And because we often take this teaching out of context, we've turned each line of this teaching into three weird, unrelated proverbs or colloquialisms that have no connection to what Jesus actually intended. Jesus says, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. And this, of course, is where we get the phrase, turn the other cheek, which we typically interpret to mean, don't fight back. Just take your lumps and walk away. It sounds like Jesus here is advocating for passivity. And this teaching is also where we get the popular shirt off your back colloquialism, only we've turned that into some act of generosity and kindness. And so we'll say things like, as the nicest guy in the world, he'd give you the shirt off his back. It's where we also get the famous go the extra mile moralism, which we've turned into a deed of charity or kindness that goes beyond the demands of duty. And so we might say, wow, she really went the 2nd mile for that person over and above what anyone else would do. Well, do you know that Jesus didn't mean any of these things when he originally gave this radical teaching? If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn your other also. If anyone sues you and takes your shirt, give your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Jesus believed that by following these radical teachings, his people could stay alive, it could reclaim their dignity as human beings, and even win over their enemies in the process. Let me explain, because all this enemy-loving, cheek-turning, coat-giving, 2nd mile-going talk probably sounds like Jesus is saying, just grit your teeth and take your lumps, accept your fate, don't fight back, just walk away, be kind and play nice. But Jesus was actually teaching his people how to reclaim their humanity, their dignity in the face of daily humiliation. Jesus here speaks about someone striking you on the right cheek, and that detail about the right cheek is crucial. Because for someone to hit you on the right cheek, they would have to use their left hand, right? But in Jesus' day, the left hand was used only for the loo, if you will, the water closet, the so-called comfort station. In other words, the left hand was used for the business of personal hygiene. It was culturally taboo to use the left hand for any other tasks, even for striking people. So if someone were to strike you on the right cheek, and they could only use their right hand, their only move would be a backhanded slap. And suddenly we see that Jesus now isn't talking about a punch to the face with a fist. He's talking about the humiliation of a backhanded slap. And doesn't that change everything? Because a slap to the face, especially a backhanded slap, is meant not to harm you, but to humiliate, to shame, or demean you. But what happens if in that moment you turn and offer the other cheek? If they can't use their left hand, then suddenly their backhanding tactic of humiliation has been subverted. They can no longer shame you with a slap to the face. By offering the other cheek, you're saying, I'm still standing. And you tried to shame me, but I'm a human being, just like you. What about the business of giving the shirt off your back? Jesus here was referring to the collateral used for a loan. Most people in securing a loan back then would offer a goat, some chickens, or maybe even some land as collateral. But the poorest of the poor, according to Deuteronomy, could hawk their outer garment. It was a long robe. At night they used it to sleep in, and during the day they used it as an overcoat. And according to the law, the creditor could take that outer garment as collateral every day, but was required to return it every night until the loan was finally repaid. Now, if you were poor, you couldn't afford to pay your taxes to the Roman government. You'd need a loan. It was an abusive, humiliating system, much like modern-day paycheck loans today. The system was stacked against you, and so Jesus said, if you can't pay your loan and your creditor sues you for your outer garment, while you're standing in the courtroom, give them your underwear too. Just take off your last stitch of clothing and stand naked before your creditor, as if to say, look at me and look at what this system does to people. You have fleeced me out of everything, even my BVDs, but here is something you cannot take. I'm still standing, I'm still human. Now, by the way, if you literally try this in a modern courtroom, you will likely compound your legal problems. But Jesus is saying here, in the face of injustice, don't let anyone rob you of your humanity. Show them that you're a real human being. Appeal to their conscience, their heart. What about this business of going the second mile? Roman soldiers were permitted by military law to force ordinary civilians to carry their packs for 1 mile, but no more than 1 mile. And so mile markers were staked along the roads for this very purpose. A Roman soldier's pack weighed about 85 pounds. It was a deeply humiliating moment for a Jew to be forced to carry the war gear of his occupying enemy. But imagine now if, after being forced to carry that pack for 1 mile, instead of giving it back to that soldier, you just straightened your back and just kept on walking with it, as if to say, I'm not your tool, and I'm not powerless, and I have agency, and I too am a human being. And imagine that soldier as he asks you to return his pack, please, now being forced to see you as an equal. This is all some serious Jesus jiu-jitsu, isn't it? Jesus is teaching what today we call nonviolent resistance. And when we hear the word nonviolence, we might assume it's synonymous with passivity or non-aggression, as if nonviolence is all about what not to do. To not speak up or to not stand up for what's right, to not act or respond in the face of evil or wrongdoing. Jesus didn't teach that our highest aim should ever be inaction, to not get involved for the sake of maintaining peace or unity. Jesus understood this way of living would only allow violence to perpetuate itself in our world. Inaction, it fails to expose the real harm being done, so that the one doing the harm can finally see it for what it is, and see himself as the one doing it, and see the one being harmed for who they really are as human. Only then, when he sees it, can he choose to stop and to change his ways? Jesus believed the only way to save the world was not by inaction in the name of peace or unity, but by our courageous actions that resist the human impulse to meet violence with violence in the name of God's loving aims. For Jesus, the cross became the means by which to call us all to stop our violent ways and to change, to be redeemed by love, by his death on a cross. Jesus took upon himself all the violence the world could throw at him. But instead of turning it back on his enemies, he showed them and us that the only way to defeat violence is to love the enemies so fiercely that he finally chooses to change. Many have embraced this way of life ever since Gandhi, Simone Weil, Myreed McGuire, Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King Jr. They each understood nonviolence as a courageous action that aims to right the wrongs they've experienced in their world. But they all knew that to right those wrongs, they had to resist the impulse to meet violence with violence to achieve their goals. And that impulse runs deep in the human psyche. It's in our DNA. It even has a name. The late theologian Walter Wink called this the myth of redemptive violence. It's a narrative as old as humanity itself. It dominates modern life and culture. The myth of redemptive violence says that there are good guys and bad guys in the world. And the only way to save the world is for the good guys to annihilate the bad guys. If you've ever seen a Popeye cartoon from way back, you've seen this myth play out over and over again. It's big, bad Brutus. He torments the good guy Popeye over and over. Or, weirdly, he abducts poor, innocent Olive Oyl. And eventually, Popeye can't take it anymore, so he swallows a can of spinach, gains the strength to beat the snot out of Brutus, and then win the hand of Olive Oyl in the process. Good triumphs over evil, and the world is set right again. This narrative is played out in just about every blockbuster movie and hit television series. Kill Bill, Django Unchained, Dirty Harry, Planet of the Apes, Walking Tall, John Wick, Game of Thrones, all the Marvel movies, even Star Wars. And the plot goes something like this. The universe is in grave danger. A malevolent galactic force is on the move, and forces for good are in distress. A terrible crisis mounts. All life is endangered. Then a courageous hero arises, and the malevolent forces are vanquished. And then a celebration ensues. We love the myth of redemptive violence. We're convinced it's how the world works. To defeat the threat of violence, you must use violence. And so it justifies violence, even the suffering of innocence, in the name of overcoming evil. It's played out in every fight, every conflict, and every war, even right now in Gaza. But Jesus taught that violence only perpetuates violence, and only love can beget love. And what he teaches us today is that this transforming love in the world actually begins with the love of self. It starts with loving ourselves. We have to remember that we have dignity and are fashioned in beauty, turning the other cheek, walking the second mile, giving up our coat. These are radical tactics that claim our dignity and remind ourselves and others that we are lovely and lovable and not to be shamed or humiliated. And this is why Martin Luther King taught that the first principle of nonviolence is that it's a way of life for courageous people. It's not a method for cowards. It does resist. It's active resistance to evil. It's aggressive spiritually and mentally and emotionally. It requires great courage. And that courage starts with the courage to love ourselves enough to claim our dignity and belovedness Have you ever seen someone do that? A fight broke out in a neighborhood one afternoon. It all started months earlier when a couple moved in next door to a man who, as he often said, didn't, quote, approve of their kind. This man proudly described himself as a Bible-believing Christian, and he openly denounced the, quote, lifestyle of the two men who now lived next door to him. And one day that couple's dog got through the back fence, as it had many times before, and it wandered into the front yard of that old man who, sadly, finally made good on his threat that he would shoot that dog if he ever saw it on his lawn again. And the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood, and when all the neighbors arrived, it was an awful scene. A lifeless dog, two weeping neighbors, and an old red-faced man with a gun. Months later, that man suffered a major stroke, and he was unable to speak or walk. And while he was in the hospital, those two neighbors of his mowed his lawn, and they hauled the trash to the curbside for his wife. They even repaired a clogged drain in the kitchen for her. Whatever you need, they said, just call us. And when that man finally came home from the hospital, they brought over some chicken noodle soup and a fresh loaf of bread and a note that said, "Welcome home. Get well soon." Our takeaways for today. Nonviolence always assumes that even our adversary can be transformed by the power of God's love. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Nonviolent resistance begins with the courage to love ourselves enough to claim our humanity and assert our dignity.